Right, so pre-WWF, always in Connecticut. Were you born in Connecticut?
Yes,
So,
born and raised. Yep.
right, so was it just WWF you were raised on, or do you get cable, and who are your favourites?
I did. I did get cable, and I started watching WCW, NWA at the time. To me, my favorites were always Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Terry Funk. Those are the Four Horsemen. Those were my go-to guys back then. But also, the first match I ever really paid attention to and watched was like Hulk Hogan beating the Iron Sheik. And just going to my dad used to take me to house shows for the WWF here, where they were still doing high schools, like little high school gymnasiums, and I would watch Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson against the Samoans, and like that, and, in a little gym in front of 500 people. So it was really all over the place. My love for it really came from the magazines. I used to love getting the Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazines, and you know just looking at the pictures was so amazing, because you didn't know a lot of the guys you saw on those things you didn't watch on television. So like seeing Carlos Colon versus Abdullah the Butcher all bloodied up from Puerto Rico, I was like, it captured your imagination. It's like, oh my God, what are these guys doing to each other? And just so much cool stuff. And back then they took it so much like a sport. It would say, Bruiser Brody banned in, Kansas City. Like, what does that even mean? He was like so tough that he got banned from wrestling there. Like, oh my God, what, did he try to kill someone? You believe that stuff because it was just done so great. And when you're a little kid looking at that stuff, it was like, whoa. So yeah, that was all over the map, but those are usually my favorites.
So it's a slightly different question. Who went on television that you looked at as a teenager or whatever, and you said, he's doing it, I can do it?
Ah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Brian Pillman.
Mm.
Brian Pillman. I love Brian Pillman. And back then, like, we were talking about earlier, wrestlers then were so big. They were so larger than life. And I remember I'm like 6 foot tall, and in high school I'm a lot bigger now, just the wrong kind of big, fat. But back in high school I was maybe 200 pounds, and I figured, Brian Pillman, he was around my height, and his weight, his wrestling weight was 225, which of course was probably a work, but I didn't know that. So I was like, well, I could do it, because everybody was so big, and I'm like, if I can get myself up to 225. I can do this, because, he was small, but back then, if you were that small, which isn't small today, you had to fly around. So the early days of PJ Walker, I was doing, little planches to the floor and cross bodies and drop kicks off the top, and just trying to be a flyer, which ended up being nothing like what I ended up doing. But back then, that's what you really had to do to try to fit in, or so I thought. But yeah, Brian Pillman was definitely one of them.
So how did you end up going to the Hart wrestling camp? Because I
Yep.
believe, obviously, there was no internet and there weren't that many wrestling schools
Sure.
around. But I believe like the Monster Factory was probably nearer to you. So how come you end up going to
There were, yeah.
how come you end up going to the Hart
Well,
place?
I didn't know any better, and those magazines once again came into play. I worked at a grocery store, kind of bagging groceries, getting the carts, the carriages, whatever you call them. And during my 15-minute break, I would go to the magazine aisle and look at the latest wrestling magazines. And I had graduated high school. And while I was reading, in the back, there was a full page ad that said Hart Brothers Dare to Be Great. And it showed a picture of a young Bret Hart, a young Owen Hart, Keith Hart, Bruce Hart. And I think there was a picture of Brian Pillman in there too, because he'd gone through the Calgary territories. And I was like, this is it. Because now I finally got a phone number, right? Because I didn't know anybody in the business, or there was no, internet then. So I literally called someone, and they answered. Somebody actually answered, and it was Bruce Hart. I spoke to him for a couple of hours, and for about 6 months, I exchanged calls and saved up enough money. And lo and behold, man, the summer of '92, I had paid 2,500 Canadian and got myself an airplane ticket to go to Calgary. And they put me up in this shady motel in the middle of nowhere with a couple of other kids that were coming in. And when I got there, I realized that the Harts weren't really going to be the ones training. Like they'd show up, Keith Hart would show up once a week, barely, and then get in the ring with you for a minute and like kick your ass. But Lance Storm, who was there the year before, and Jericho and those guys would come through and kind of, mostly Storm though, would come through and train you. So, and Lance was great, actually. He was one of the best things that could have happened to me because he really had patience. And even though he was still young in the game, he understood it very well. And there was a rich culture of guys that would just show up to get ring time. You know what I mean? So you'd end up learning from a bunch of different people. So it was actually at the end of the day, even though it wasn't, I wasn't getting trained by the Hart, I still was able to kind of use the Hart name. And it was more, you know what I mean? Yeah. It was more show than anything else. But hey, I paid the Harts that money, so to hell, I'm going to use that name. And and that's what it was. But it was a great experience. It really was. A very cool experience, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
So, did you ever get in the ring with Bruce, even for a minute? Did you even see him?
Not Bruce. Nope. Bruce, no. But Keith Hart I must say, was there once a week, and he would always come in the ring and do drills with you, where give you hip tosses and body slams, and there were not enough people. I can't say anything negative, but certainly wasn't as advertised. Let's just say that.
Fair enough then. So obviously you get trained and you do the nascent independents, I suppose, because the territories have gone, smaller independents are around. Who was the biggest star, the first big star that you ever wrestled on the independents, maybe on the way down, that you learned something from, or maybe they were a total dick?
Sure. My career was actually really small on the independents. What happened when I was done with the Harts in '92, I came back home, and the people in Calgary were starting a promotion called Rocky Mountain Pro Wrestling. And the first show was October 9th, I'd like to say. I'll never forget it. No, lying. October 16th, because it was my 19th birthday. And I flew all the way to Calgary, and I had a 10-week ticket because they were going to be running weekly shows in Calgary. So I figured I can go there and cut my teeth. My first match was against some kid that I went to wrestling school with, who still wrestles out of Ontario, Brett Farrell, who wrestles as Big Daddy Hammer. Never really made a name for himself. But I also wrestled, in those 10 matches, I wrestled Jericho. I wrestled a young Lance Storm, Jerry Morrow, who'd wrestled in Calgary Stampede and New Japan. But just guys like that, nobody of real fame. And then I came home, and I maybe did 3 or 4 shows on the independents, where I finally went to a WWE house show just as one of the boys. I showed up with my gear, as they always tell you to do. And, I told Tony Gurria was there. He was the producer on hand, or agent. And I asked him if he needed anybody, whatever. And he said, no, we're good for tonight, but you could watch the show here. I told him I was trained by the Harts in Calgary. And of course, they didn't need me. I watched the show. So afterward, they just go to say goodbye and say thank you for the hospitality. And he goes, well, you're from Connecticut. I said, yeah. He goes, well, we're starting a new show in Manhattan called Monday Night Raw. He goes, we're going to need some extras if you want to come and do a couple jobs for us. So they had me come in a couple of weeks from that date. And my first match was against the narcissist Lex Luger. And from that moment on, I literally started getting called up almost on a weekly basis to do Raws and WWF TV, and maybe a couple of indies in between. I probably had 20 indie matches before I got signed by the WWE, believe it or not.
Really?
And it was just being in the right place at the right time at that moment. It's very unique, and I was very, very lucky.
So did you, while you were signed by WWF, let's say early '93, or were we talking late '92 here? Around
94.
Oh, sorry,
August of 94.
Yep. So in that year and a half from, or maybe it's 2 years, isn't it? So from the Hart camp to WWF, I mean, how many independent shows were you getting maybe a week, as well as enhancement talent for the WWF?
A week?
Or are we talking months?
Oh, probably maybe once a month.
Wow.
Once a month, maybe, because there wasn't a lot here. Yeah, because I did, I would do anything in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, but back then, there wasn't a lot. It wasn't like it is today where there's so much wrestling. Back then, it really was very tight, because the community was still so small. You know what I mean? Without the internet, you get a hold of people. There's so many shows. Back then, you really only had 2 or 3 indie shows in the area, and you had to know somebody, right? You'd have to know the promoter, and it was usually somebody that ran a school, and it was like pay to play. You'd have to be part of their little scheme to get booked, so it was very difficult in those days. I'm actually very surprised, because this horror stories I hear, that I didn't have to go to another wrestling school here, because what they normally do is you go to a wrestling school in the area, and then they put on shows which allow you to work and be seen. So I had no connections here. That was my biggest mistake. Well, not mistake, but the biggest problem I had going to Calgary. I knew everybody out there, not over here in my home area. So, if I hadn't gone to the WWE house show just as a chance I took, I don't think I would have ever had the career. It was just one moment where I got lucky. I always say that right place, right time is the only reason I made it.
Do you smell what The Rock is cooking?
Enough is enough!
Booty poo candy
I had him writhing in pain from my sharpshooter.
Rocky!
I am not a nugget!
Stick him straight up your candy ass!
I kicked your leg out of your leg.
The Rock has come back!